Okay, let's get started. Welcome back, everyone. So for the second day of the Simons Fellows Meet the Fellows event for fall 2022. So we have two sessions to round off this lovely event. So the first session, there'll be 4 talks, and the first talk is given by Gautam Goel on competitive control.
Thanks, Venkat, for the introduction. So hi, I'm Gautam. I'm a postdoc here at the Simons Institute. I just graduated from Caltech a few months ago. Today, everything I'll be talking about is joint work with my PhD advisor, Babak Hasibi. Great. So I want to start off by giving a very brief introduction to control theory. So what is control? Control is a branch of mathematics that studies how you regulate or stabilize evolving dynamical systems, right? So in this Boeing 747, maybe this Boeing 747 has some autopilot, and this autopilot will guide the plane where it needs to go, even if the plane is sort of perturbed by turbulence or storms or things like that. And here in this insulin pump, you know, the user is eating food, and that food is raising their blood sugar, and the insulin pump will dynamically regulate their blood sugar by injecting insulin, so as to sort of keep the blood sugar at the desired level. So in both examples, there's some algorithm that sort of guides the system towards desirable trajectories and avoids undesirable trajectories. Great. So one of the most widely studied models for control is called linear quadratic control. So here's how it looks. So there's this state X, the state of the system, and the state evolves according to this linear equation. So the next state at time t+1 is a linear combination of the previous state, xt, my control input, ut, which the algorithm selects, and some external disturbance, wt, which is sort of exogenous. The algorithm has no control over it. So the wt might represent the turbulence, or it might represent the spike in blood sugar when the user eats something. So the wt is selected by nature. It's outside of the algorithm's control. And the algorithm incurs some costs in each time step. And this cost has 2 terms. The first term represents how desirable the state is the state where we want it to be. And the second term you can think of as a regularizer. It penalizes the algorithm for investing a lot of energy or work in the control action, right? In the real world, it always takes some work to guide my plane where I want it to go, right? It takes fuel, for example. And so the second term sort of represents that fact that I have to put energy into stabilizing the system. In this talk, I'll assume that the dynamics are known and the initial condition is x not equals 0. And for simplicity, I will also assume that these matrices Q and R are just the identity, but I want to emphasize that's only for the talk. It just makes the talk simpler. In general, they can be arbitrary, positive, definite matrices. And this is an online problem. In each time step, the controller can pick a control action UT given the history of disturbances observed so far, but it's not allowed to use information about the future, right? So the controller can say, here's what I've observed, and now here's the action I'll pick. This is a little bit like in Bandits, where in each round, I pick an arm given the history of losses I've observed so far. But of course, I don't know anything about the future losses. And the goal of the online algorithm is very simple. It's to minimize its cost over all rounds. And I'll just mention as an aside that I've allowed the policy pi to be time varying. So I've allowed it to be indexed by time. This also happens in Bandits, where at the beginning I do exploration, at the end I do exploitation. So the policy is varying. Okay. And let me just introduce some notation very quickly. When I describe a variable without a subscript, I mean the full sequence, okay? And I'll let the energy of a sequence simply be the sum of the squared L2 norms of its components. This energy is sort of a measure of how big a sequence is, in some sense. And with this convention that Q and R are the identity, the cost incurred by the controller has a very simple form. It's simply the energy in X plus the energy in U. Great. So there's 2 classical approaches to control. One of them is called H2 control. This is very simple. We assume that the disturbance is generated stochastically, and the goal of the controller is to minimize its expected cost. There's a more sophisticated approach to control, which was very popular in the 1980s, called H-infinity control. So in this model, we take a worst case perspective, and we model control as the minimax game played between the controller and nature, which is selecting the W's. And the goal of nature is to try to find a disturbance which is small in energy, but which forces the controller to incur a high cost, And the controller's goal is to be robust to this situation, to try to minimize this ratio. So the intuition is the controller is saying, well, yeah, you can make me incur a high cost, but you better put a lot of energy into that disturbance, right? You can't just give me a tap and cause me to fall over. It has to be like a really concerted effort. And we know both theoretically and empirically that you can't mix and match. In other words, if you take an H2 controller and look at its worst case performance, it's lousy. If you take an H infinity controller, look at its performance in a stochastic setting, it's lousy. So this motivates the design of controllers, which will try to perform well no matter how the disturbance is generated. And that's what this talk is about. So I'm going to look at control through the lens of competitive analysis, which Anupam talked about in his bootcamp lecture. So here's the idea. I'll again model control as a minimax game, but instead of comparing the cost of the online algorithm to the energy of the disturbance, I'll instead compare it to the cost of this clairvoyant offline optimal controller, which is the controller that selects the optimal sequence of control actions given full knowledge of the disturbance sequence W. So it's saying sort of counterfactually, if you did have perfect information about the past and the future, what is the optimal sequence of control actions? And the intuition is that if my competitive ratio is low, then I'm closely tracking the optimal possible performance, right? Because the offline optimal is sort of the globally optimal controller. So if this is low, I'm good no matter how the sequence is generated. And the idea is to reduce this problem to H infinity control in a synthetic system. So they're both minimax games. And you give me some matrices A and B driven by some disturbance W. I'll construct some A prime, B prime, and a synthetic disturbance W prime, such that the control actions selected by an H infinity controller in the synthetic system exactly coincide with the optimal competitive ratio control actions in the original system. Okay, it's a reduction. Okay, let me just sketch this out briefly. So there's this linear dynamics equation, and we start off with this initial condition x naught. If I plug that in, I can solve for x1, just plugging that into the dynamics. And I can plug that in and get x2. I can plug that in and so on and so forth. And what I can do is I can rewrite each of the x's as a linear combination of all the previous disturbances and all the previous control inputs. And I can collect that linear system in a big matrix equation. Okay, so I'll say that this matrix equation is x is equal to fu plus gw, where f is this matrix that maps u into x, and g is this matrix that maps w into x. Okay, and the thing I like about this f and g is that it sort of gives me like the sort of global view of how the full sequence of x's and u's and w's are related. And the nice thing is that the offline optimal cost has a very simple form. It's simply a quadratic function in this w's in terms of these f and g's. And since I can now rewrite the competitive control problem in this form. So what I've done here is I've simply taken the offline optimal cost and I plugged it in the denominator, right? So that's the denominator of the ratio. The thing in the numerator, the online cost, we said it was the sum of the energy in x and the energy in w, but we also agreed that the states x have this linear form fu equals gw, right? So this ratio is exactly the competitive ratio we saw before. Okay, and the goal is again is to minimize that ratio over all policies pi. Great. One more slide. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So here's what I'll do. So I'm going to sketch out this reduction. So I'll define delta to be sort of this Koleski factor of the matrix I plus FF transpose, right? So I plus FF transpose is certainly positive definite. It has a Koleski factorization, and I'll let delta be this Koleski factor. And I'll define the synthetic disturbance W prime to simply be delta inverse GW. Okay, so why did I pick that one? Why am I calling that W prime? Well, there's a few nice things that happen. So my dynamics, x is equal to fu plus gw, they can be rewritten in terms of w prime instead of w, right? Because the delta here will cancel the delta inverse, so I just get back exactly the equation I had before, okay? And my offline cost, which we agreed was a quadratic function of w, has a very simple description in terms of w prime. It's simply the energy in w prime, okay? So the competitive ratio I showed you on the previous slide has the following form. It's the so in the denominator we have the energy in w prime, and on the numerator we have the cost incurred by the online algorithm, but now it's in this synthetic system fu plus delta w prime. Okay, so I've rewritten the competitive ratio problem, as an H infinity problem in the synthetic system, fu, x is equal to fu plus delta w prime, driven by the synthetic disturbance w prime. So this shows the connection. What I haven't shown you so far is how you do this efficiently, right? If someone came to you and said, I have these huge T by T block matrices, F and G, and you factor them, no engineer is actually gonna run that. You can show that you can actually do this efficiently, and that's the hard problem. So you can actually simplify this quite a bit and get a very explicit form for the competitive controller. I'm not gonna have time to talk about that. If you're interested, come chat with me. Thanks for listening.
Thanks a lot. Any questions for Gautam?
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for a really nice talk. So it seems that competitive control is somewhat between H2 and H infinity, right?
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Is that any other notion that interpolates, goes between H2 to H infinity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this talk, I looked at the ratio between the online and offline costs. It's also natural to look at the difference, right? So this is sometimes called regret, and especially dynamic regret. So I have a parallel line of work on dynamic regret that studies how you look at differences. And there's also more restrictive notions of regret, like policy regret and static regret, which other people have looked at. And it turns out that there are actually a lot of surprising connections. So for example, when doing regret minimization, it's common to use some sort of gradient descent, online gradient descent. You can show that the algorithms I described also have a connection to gradient descent. So I'm not gonna have time to talk about it right now.
I had a quick question.
Sure.
So there should be some restriction on pi that it is causal, right?
Exactly, yes.
So when you make transform to this W prime, the synthetic thing, how do you model that?
That is an excellent question. So that you nailed it. So this matrix G is causal. That represents the fact that my states only depend on the previous part. This delta, it has to also be causal. Okay. If delta is also causal, lower triangular, then delta inverse GW will also be causal. And that means that my synthetic disturbance at time t is only a linear function, a linear combination of the previously observed disturbances. So you're absolutely right. I have to keep track of causality to make sure that I can implement this in the real world. My controller can't depend on the future, right?
And that delta is in fact
yes. Actually, yes. Actually, there are infinitely many Kolesky factors, but there's only one unique delta causal one, okay. And you can find it explicitly. I didn't go to that detail. Yeah, that's a good question.
Questions? Okay. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks so much.
The next speaker.